Strategic planning and performance management. Bonus Unit B, involving a board in strategic planning. There is a considerable conjecture in board and management circles regarding the extent to which a board should be involved in the role of strategic planning. Should it get into details or remain just from the process, letting management get on with it and only becoming involved at the final approval stage? Or is there an intermediate approach that captures the best elements of these two circumstances? The purpose of this Unit B is to describe three options, weigh up the pros and cons of each, and recommend a general desirable route for a board to take. The material is based on several experiences that we have had in facilitating strategic planning sessions for organizations, but we especially draw on our observations of the lotteries organizations we have written about in past units. You will remember that this organization is government owned and operates as a public sector corporation. Its products are lottery tickets, which are bought through retail stores acting as agents. As a public sector corporation, it pays an annual dividend to its owner, the government. So, a government corporation, it is run very much like a private sector organization, but it does have, as one would expect, some unusual reporting relationship to its owner. Unlike a private sector organization, it is also subject to a political influence. The lotteries experimented with the two extremes outlined here in this unit bonus B. Let's now look at the first of these, which we call the hands-on approach. Hands-on approach. In this approach, the board becomes intimately involved in the strategic planning activity. For example, board members, as well as the chief executive and members of the organization who make up the planning team, meet together as part of a strategic planning activity. The meeting may take over 2 days at either a resort or a hotel outside of the organization. In this scenario, board members become equal partners with management in developing the strategic plan. In our so-called lottery organization, board members sat down with a planning team composed of the CEO and 16 other organization members. Over the course of 2 days, he developed a strategic plan with the CEO and his team. A number of problems arose. For one thing, board members became too involved in the detail of the strategic plan and ended up actually trying to write the plan by themselves, despite their lack of sufficient in-depth industry knowledge to do it well. Another problem was that the members of the planning team sat back and deferred to board members. They thought that the board members had all the answers, and so were reluctant to speak up in their presence, they were kind of intimidated by them. Another reason for their reluctance was that the board members were not known to the team. They were kind of strangers. Team members didn't feel right about talking plainly in front of them, nor did they want to embarrass either the CEO or senior management by discussing problems of which the board might not be aware. So it happened a scenario of silos in which the planning team had the information but were intimidated by the board members. A further result of board members becoming too involved in that the plan may cease to be owned by the planning team itself. It may reflect what the board wants or what the planning team thinks the board wants, but it is no longer something for which the planning team and management feel accountable. Some may even describe the final product as the board's plan. For all these reasons, the hands-on approach, as described here, is generally to be avoided in strategic planning. It can be a real waste of the board's and the planning team's time and effort, since it does little, if anything, to improve the quality of either the planning process or the complete strategic plan. Hands-off approach. Having experienced all the problems described in the previous section, hands-on approach, with no observable benefits, the lottery's board went to another extreme. The next time the organization undertook its strategic planning. In this hands-off approach, board members play little part in the strategic planning process until the plan has been fully developed. The strategic planning activity is undertaken by the chief executive and the planning team, whose members are drawn from within the organization. Typically, board involvement occurs when the chief executive presents the strategic plan to the board. Unfortunately, the strategic plan, the lottery's management, produced recommended changes that did not meet board requirements. The result was that it was rejected by the board, and the strategic planning process was thrown into a disarray. One problem with the hands-off approach is that the planning team is in the dark regarding the board's expectations, as the latter are not expressed upfront. The plan that is produced may well be one that the board doesn't like, as happened to the lottery's plan. When the board does not put in the time and effort to determine what its own requirements are, it is a case of trying to shoot a moving target. Another problem with this hands-off approach is the time that is wasted while the strategic plan is revised in the light of board expectations. While the board intentions may have been good, an example, not to interfere, the hands-off approach does not do no one any good. Management has been forced to try to produce a plan that meets unknown criteria. Clearly, the two extremes, the hands-on and hands-off, have their shortcomings. For this reason, we now turn to a third method. Planning parameters approach. In this approach, a board presents a set of planning parameters to its chief executive, who then takes them forward with his or her planning team. The parameters are broad guided and guidelines for the development of the strategic plan. When the chief executive presents the team's plan to the board, it has the opportunity to assess it against the parameters it laid down at the beginning of the process. An elevator is in operation here. Let's see figure B.1. Strategic planning process elevator effect. The elevator starts with the board, moves down into the organization via the chief executive to the planning team or teams, and comes back up from the planning team or teams via the chief executive to the board. The board starts the elevator moving by developing planning parameters that the chief executive and his or her planning team need to take in account in developing the strategic plan. At the end of the elevator's travel, the chief executive passes a strategic plan to the board that is in keeping with the board's own parameters. In our case of the lottery organization, having had its previous experience with board involvement, redesigned its planning to follow this parameters approach, the elevator effect approach. Among the benefits that followed was that the board members no longer wasted their time in discussions that were often far too detailed for their participation. Further planning team members were no longer placed in a position in which they felt a need to defer to board members. They had to make up their own minds as to what was best for their organization and what the details of the strategic plan should be. Management was no longer working in the dark, but within the planning parameters established by the board. A further benefit from this elevator effect approach is that it forces some discipline on a board. It can no longer sit back and wait for the strategic plan with a view that we'd know a good one if we saw it. A board really has to sit down at the first stage of the planning process and decide what their assessment criteria or planning parameters should be. Under this approach, any changes that are required to the executive and strategic plan when it is presented to the board by the chief executive are usually not radical. Planning is more streamlined too, since there is usually no need to backtrack. Let's see some examples of planning parameters. Figure B.2 contains a number of examples of planning parameters that a board might employ or produce. Let's check it out. The first one, the planning horizon, relates to the strategic plan itself. Some plans have a horizon of, let's say, 2 or 3 years, others shorter, and others longer. It depends on the industry and the amount of change occurring in it. For some industries, there is little certainty about a 2-year span. Change is lower in others, and a longer period is not only possible but highly desirable. Another planning parameter that a board may devise relates to the capital expenditure limitations. From its knowledge to the finances of the organization, a board may decide to restrict the amount of capital available to management. It may formulate this limitation on the basis of the organization's debt situation. Of course, It's important for a planning team to know this limitation up front, as it may restrict the activities proposed. Other planning parameters relate to strategic plan. Outcomes, such as profit, either in dollar terms or as a percentage of shareholders' funds, or as revenue, either by product group or geography, or by domestic and export sources. A parameter that is clearly the province of a board is the required percentage return on the shareholders' funds. As a representative of shareholders' interests, the board is in a position to lay down requirements to this management in this particular regard. Naturally, these requirements would impact on profit and cash flow as well. But a board may also rightly express a view on the sources of revenue. In figure B.2, these streams are shown as a percentage of revenue from exports or certain products, service groups, or geographic region. For instance, a CEO and his or her planning team may be told that certain revenues need to come from markets other than the domestic. A board may also provide guidelines to management regarding the percentage of revenue from new products as compared with older ones. It may suggest that certain geographic regions be avoided for social and political reasons, so as to take no risks. Let's see the risk that is imposed in the Eastern European Russian front. Growth is another parameter to be considered by a board. A certain percentage return on shareholders' funds might be achieved at the expense of growth. So a board may require that revenue growth keep pace with the return on shareholders' funds. The last three items in figure B.2 relate to policy parameters. These might include the type of business the organization should avoid for reasons of litigation, for example, or a policy on diversification and acquisition. Lastly, a board may identify certain major influences of an economic or social nature that need to be encompassed by the strategic plan. As I was saying, the problems in Eastern Europe, the problems about supply chain cuts, the problems about health restrictions imposed to companies, let's say in 2020, 2021. Then, these are some of the variety of planning parameters that might be employed by a board. Let's conclude. In explaining these three distinct approaches, we have by no means exhausted the options available to the board for its participation in strategic planning. We have witnessed many others apart from this. For various reasons, the hands-on and hands-off approaches have been found wanting, while the planning parameters approach has been found to have certain advantages. All boards and management should take a closer look at the strategic planning process that operates within their organizations or business units. Boards should review the form their involvement takes and question whether or not that involvement compromises their ability to take an impartial view of the strategic plan when it is produced by the management. Boards should also consider whether they are giving sufficient guidance to management in their attempts to develop a satisfactory strategic plan. The requirement of boards to give guidance, yet be able to impartially assess a strategic plan, that it is developed by management. It is generally met by the planning parameters approach, as we discussed in the figure B.2. Said this, I hope this bonus unit B was of interest. Please try to review it and reflect on your current experience within your organizations or business unit. What type of approach does the board uses in order to participate in strategic planning? Hands-on, hands-off, or with some planning parameters? Please try to write down your notes and reflect on them. What do you think are the pros and cons of each one of the approaches? So, this was Victor Romo speaking, your strategic planning and performance management coach. Please, I'm open to receive any comments or questions about this wide and heavily thing about strategic planning and performance management, which can be a little bit tricky if not followed by all the things that we discussed in the course. If you want to go back to the things discussed during the course, please try to do it, and I will be glad to point you a direction where you can find it. So, said this, I hope you have a good day, have a good strategic planning with your boards and planning teams, and see you in the next bonus unit C, competitive advantage along value chains. Please try to subscribe and try to follow the Talent LMS course in the link described. Thank you and goodbye.